Hi everyone, this is Matt again talking about the Sandbox first one in this series with the ASA 2.0 design for GNS3. I did mention in the last video that we were going to talk about how the ASA is connecting through, and I think it would just be better just from a network design perspective to just mock it up. So I'm using a tool called Lucid Charts. I don't get paid for that. This isn't a product thing. I'm nobody even cares enough about my videos anyways. But this is what I use to kind of do logical diagrams. And I would recommend, if you're actually going to get into GNS3 and you're going to get into sandboxing, get into the habit of starting to mock it up and design. Okay, because I already know how it works, but for the sake of the argument, you know, you're just starting out. How is this supposed to work? So we're going to kind of diagram and draw pictures. One of the things that I tell my students, because I work full time at a company, but then I teach part time. You know, I try to put myself in the new person's shoes, right? Sometimes the technical babble kind of gets a little overwhelming, and it's just better to draw pictures. So we're just going to draw a picture so that you clearly understand what is connecting to what, so that you can make your substitutions and changes, okay? We're just going to grab some basic shapes. I don't really care about the shapes. We're just going to say, you know what? We're going to call this shape the GNS3 VM. We're just going to kind of let that hang out over here. And then we're going to create another shape here. We're going to call this one, how about host machine? Okay. And then we're going to have a third one. We're going to have, let's say, this one. We'll call this one ASA V. The V stands for virtual ASA inside GNS3. And so if you were to try to show this graphically on one screenshot, it would just be a mess because you can't even break it apart. So what I would recommend doing is establishing the connections logically. So what we want is the ASA to connect to the GNS3 virtual machine. Okay, and then we're going to want the host machine to connect to the GNS3 virtual machine as well. And all these connections are going to be handled using a fourth option, which most engineers and people that are trying to get emulations working, is your hypervisor network manager. So in this case, it could be, you know, like in this case we're using VMware or VirtualBox, something like that. That has to be logically noted because, quite frankly, that's the secret to how everything really connects. So then, what are some of the things you would need to do to make this work? Well, if we start listing out what has to happen first, you know your GNS3 topology would need to have the cloud interface using VMnet 8. So the first step you got to do inside GNS3, when you have your ASA running and everything's great, go into the cloud interface and you're going to bind it to VMware Net 8. Why? Because this thing is going to listen on that subnet. So the idea is, the first step is, let's get the ASA to receive an IP address from that DHCP service, as I mentioned in previous videos, that there is a DHCP service running in that module, and it's going to send an IP address back to the ASA. That's just the simplest way of doing it, because quite frankly, when you're using a cloud interface in GNS3, you could bind it to any adapter. And I think what gets missed on a new student is you really have to pay attention to what adapter is being bound to it, because you're going to watch a video and some fancy pants guy is just going to be like rambling on about how easy it is. Some systems, if you've loaded VMware on your operating system, it's a hypervisor. So that means with VMware, you've got eight potential virtual network cards on your host system, and it's so easy to get those confused. I've got them confused. So really pay attention to what you're binding in the GNS3 cloud, because that has to go directly to which virtual network that VMware you're assigning it to. So VMware 8 is just one that I picked because it does some natting, and you have to understand what natting does. So it's just kind of convenient that you would use VMware Net 8 because it does some NAT translation beyond the VMware hypervisor. So that's kind of the first thing you got to understand, is getting that DHCP service assigned to this interface that goes to a cloud. So let me see if I can find a cloud image. Maybe this will work. So yeah, so your cloud is somewhere here. It's a cloud using VMnet 8 adapter. And what's nice about that is your GNS3 is also a virtual machine using VMnet 8 on one of those adapters. Remember, I had two of them. So now you've got GNS3 VM running using a VMware Net 8. So we can kind of annotate this here. And so in theory, if you're doing this correctly, you've got your ASA, whatever interface you're going to choose for ASA, connecting to the cloud inside GNS3. GNS3 is now binding it to the interface, the virtual interface of VMnet 8, because GNS3 is actually providing that image, right? It's all running inside GNS3, so that makes sense. And most users confuse who's actually receiving this interface. Is it the GNS3 VM, or is it your host machine? Well, in this diagram, because we're mocking it up, clearly the GNS3 VM has its own interface to VMware 8 because it's in itself a virtual machine. And now you're having the ASA bind to the same interface that the GNS3 VM is using. So now what you got here going on is you've now got two devices effectively being managed by that one subnet, that one network manager subnet, and they all kind of relate. So you have a DHCP that's offering an IP address here. You already have an IP address listed inside GNS3, and we can show that. So I'm just going to type it up real quick, just so that we're absolutely clear based on IP addresses. So this guy, basically received from the DHCP 192.168.122.128. Because in a previous video, we kind of talked about the VMware network, and that when you turn it on and you set the DHCP service on, it defaults to a range of IP addresses. Well, the first one is, I typoed that, is 128. So, and it's also important to understand subnetting in that, it's using a /24 network. So the manager is basically putting everyone on /24 network. And those of you that don't understand subnetting, I'll just tell you briefly that the 192.168.122, that entire side is the network identifier. So that means your GNS3 VM, to communicate with this, would also have to be on the same subnet, in the same network, which would mean logically, since we are drawing up a logical diagram, this one would have to be 192.168.122.x, like we really don't care, just so long as it gets a host IP address, because this last octet is the identifier of the host. The first 3 octets identify the network. So clearly you can see, in theory, logically, the way the diagram's shaping up, it's looking like GNS3 should be able to communicate through this hypervisor, right? Through this network manager. Are we clear on that? So I would say at this point we're at 10 minutes. Theory, that should work. But here's a neat little wrinkle that most people don't think about. What about your host machine? What role does the host machine play in? Well, you can find out. Let me see if I could show my host machine real quick without... I got to type it up. Hold on a second. IP config. Let me see if I can find it. So here's the dilemma that I have. Look at this. I've got a ton of virtual network interfaces, a ton of them. So what you're going to want to do is find the one that is on that same subnet. So let's see if we could find it. No, I don't see that. That's Hyper-V. We don't care about that. Let's go all the way at the top. Let's try this again. Loop back, virtual host Ethernet adapter. No. No, I don't see that. I don't see that. Nope. Okay. So I don't see it in here. Let's look at the... Let me look at the network and sharing center. 1 second. I'm not quite seeing it yet. Why am I'm kind of brain farting here? Hmm. 1 second. There it is. I don't know why I couldn't see it before. But yeah, it's there. So let's see something. Let's try pinging. Well, first let's take a look at the GNS3 machine. Okay. All right. So this guy's got a 192.168.122.1. Now I've already mucked around with the ASA, so it'll allow pinging. So if you ping 192.168.122.128, it should come right up. Maybe I didn't allow that. Hold on a second. Let me take a look at the GNS3. Oh, it would help to launch GNS3, wouldn't it? Sure. So now we gotta wait a minute for that. I didn't even set up the lab yet. So let's get that going. Turn this on. There we go. That would help. Watch the pretty lights. And while that's going, we could finish off our diagram real quick. So the idea was, depending on what you bind the device inside GNS3 to makes a huge difference. So here's the chain. ASA, the interface, connects to the cloud. The cloud is binding to whatever hypervisor you're using. If it's VMware, you're going to use the network manager from VMware. If it's VirtualBox, you're going to bind it to the VirtualBox network manager. So those are the two options, right? But these connections are being handled inside VMware, which means your GNS3 VM should also have a network interface on that same VMnet 8. So once you got that clear, in theory, this is just a plan, this is just the logically, because they're in the 192.168.122 network, they should be able to communicate using this. Okay, your host machine has an adapter. That's what I was trying to bring out, and then I just showed all my network adapters. But the point was, the host machine also has, usually it's a 192.168.122.1, right? That's the actual virtual adapter for VMware Net 8 on your host machine. So in theory, the magic here is that all these devices have one interface that is on the same subnet, and it's the VMware Net Manager that's doing all the magic, all the backend, doing all the routing. It knows the three connections to all three of those devices. That's how this is working. Okay, it's critical. The fact that we throw in an ASA into the mix just means that I didn't configure the ASA to accept the ICMP. I mean, I might have not added the rule because I've torn it and built it. So we could do another video about that. But we're kind of on 17 minutes again. I kind of wanted to show you that, there's a lot of thought given into how you're going to build your sandbox. This has not been discussed anywhere. I get irritated as heck about the fact that, people are learning to get certified, but not doing the things that really businesses would expect you to know. Draw your diagrams, make logical connections, talk about it, explain it, do some real engineering. Don't just go in and just start mucking around with GNS3 thinking you could just willy-nilly it. Obviously, there's a lot of thought and discussion into these things, and in the next video, we're going to actually start doing some testing between the connections. Maybe I'll whip up another copy of ASA to try to show you the DHCP service working, because what I want to show in real time, we'll probably do some labbing where all we want is the ASA to receive an IP address from this network manager. That's all we care about in the next video. Get that going, then you know your GNS3 is going to work, then you know your host machine is going to work talking to that ASA. All right, it was good talking, and catch you later.